It had started as a simple road trip, just me and Lena heading from Dallas to Destin to spend a few days at my grandparents' house by the beach. The kind of trip that was supposed to be relaxing, just the two of us, listening to music, stopping for fast food, and enjoying the open road. But looking back, I realize now that a single mistake, a tiny moment of carelessness, almost cost us our lives. I had always had a habit of drinking too much water, which meant frequent stops along the way. Lena made fun of me for it, but she never really minded, until that night. Somewhere outside Baton Rouge, we pulled into a McDonald's to stretch our legs and grab something to eat. That's when we first saw him. The guy looked like he had been living on the road for years. His clothes were stained and torn, his beard was matted with what looked like food, and he had that vacant yet piercing look in his eyes, the kind that made your stomach tighten without you knowing why. He was already inside when we walked in, sitting alone at a corner booth. But at some point, he got up and sat near us, too close to be a coincidence. At first, I tried to ignore him, focusing on my burger and fries, but then he started talking. Not directly to us, but more like tossing questions into the air, waiting for one of us to take the bait. Where we were headed, how long we'd be on the road, if we had family nearby. Lena, always too friendly for her own good, answered without thinking. She mentioned that we were on a long trip, just the two of us, far from home. The moment the words left her mouth, something in my gut twisted. I didn't like how he nodded, how his lips curled into a smile like he had just learned something valuable. I rushed through the rest of my meal, suddenly eager to get back on the road. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I checked the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. His old beat-up truck rolling out right after us. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. The guy had to go somewhere too, right? But the longer we drove, the more I noticed the pattern. Every turn I made, he made too. Every lane change, every speed adjustment. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and I didn't like being the mouse. Lena still wasn't convinced at first, said I was being paranoid. But then, as I switched lanes for the fourth time and he followed like a shadow, her voice wavered. That's when we knew for sure. I pressed harder on the gas, watching as the speedometer climbed. Maybe I could lose him if I pushed fast enough. But no matter how fast I went, he stayed right there, his headlights glowing in my mirror like the eyes of a predator. Lena suggested stopping at a rest area to test him, to see if he would follow us inside. At first it sounded insane. Why stop when we could keep running? But if this guy was truly after us, it was better to know now than to let him keep tailing us into the night. I took the next exit, pulling into a nearly empty rest stop just past Mobile, Alabama. The place was dimly lit, with only a couple of vending machines and an old gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in hours. We parked, waiting, holding our breath. And then, seconds later, his truck rolled in, parking right next to us. A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He stepped out, moving slow but deliberate, his posture too relaxed for someone who had just happened to make the same stop as us. And then I saw it, something metallic in his hand, catching the dim light. A knife. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned to Lena, telling her to grab her phone to call for help. But there was no time to think. He was already coming for us. The second I saw the knife in his hand, everything else faded away. My body reacted before my brain even processed what was happening. I pushed Lena toward the car, barely giving her time to stumble back. My only thought was that I had to keep him away from her. Joe moved with a strange kind of confidence, like he had done this before. His grip on the knife was tight, his eyes locked onto me as if he already knew how this would end. I tried to put space between us, stepping back toward my car, but he was fast, faster than I expected. In a blink, he lunged forward. I twisted at the last second, but not fast enough. A sharp, searing pain exploded in my back as the knife sank in just below my shoulder blade. The world tilted. My legs almost gave out, but I forced myself to stay on my feet. He pulled the knife back, ready to strike again, but this time I was ready. Adrenaline drowned out the pain and I kicked out, my foot connecting hard with his knee. He stumbled, losing his balance, and that was the only opening I needed. I threw myself at him, knocking us both to the ground. The impact sent another shock of pain through my back, but I didn't care. My fists found his face again and again until I felt his body go limp beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my blood dripping down my arm. I staggered to my feet, my vision blurring at the edges. Behind me, Lena was shouting into the phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. I grabbed the car door for support, the pain finally catching up to me. I didn't know if Joe was still conscious. I didn't care. I just knew we had to get out of there. Lena helped me into the passenger seat, and the moment the engine roared to life, she floored it. The rest stop disappeared in the rear-view mirror, leaving Joe sprawled out in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. The pain became unbearable. My breathing was uneven, and the warmth spreading down my back told me I was losing more blood than I should have been. Lena drove like a maniac, speeding through the empty highway, heading toward the nearest hospital she could find on her GPS. I fought to keep my eyes open, to stay conscious, but the world kept tilting, pulling me under. I didn't even realize when we reached the hospital. The next thing I knew, I was being pulled out of the car, voices shouting, hands gripping my shoulders. The fluorescent lights above me blurred as everything faded to black. When I woke up, everything felt distant, like I was surfacing from a dream I couldn't quite remember. The room was too bright, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. My body ached all over, but the worst pain was in my back, a deep, dull throb that flared every time I tried to move. Lena was there, sitting in the chair beside my bed, her face pale and exhausted. The relief in her eyes was obvious when she saw me awake, but there was something else too. Guilt. Before I could ask, a police officer stepped into the room, a notepad in hand. He told me they had found Joe at the rest stop, unconscious but still breathing. Paramedics had taken him to the same hospital, though he was in a coma. Apparently he had no ID, no records, nothing to indicate who he was or where he had come from. The officer explained that Joe had been seen in multiple states, always lingering at gas stations and fast food places along major highways, but no one had ever connected him to anything serious, until now. Lena kept blaming herself, saying if she hadn't told him we were alone, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I knew that wasn't fair. There was no way she could have predicted what kind of person he was. If it hadn't been us, it would have been someone else. The thought made me sick. I spent another day in the hospital before they let me go. The stab wound wasn't as bad as I had feared, but it would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of that night. The drive to Destin was silent. We barely spoke, both lost in our own thoughts. The road, once something I had loved, now felt different. Every car behind us, every stop we made, left me on edge. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see those same headlights trailing us again. We made it to my grandparents' house, but something about the trip felt hollow now. The excitement, the anticipation, it was all gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been inches from death, that if things had gone just a little differently, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. For weeks after, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, my mind replaying the moment he pulled out that knife. I never saw any updates about Joe after that. No news articles, no follow-ups. It was like he had just disappeared. But every time I get behind the wheel now, I remember. Because once you realize that monsters don't just exist in horror movies, that they can sit next to you in a McDonald's, watching, waiting, you never truly feel safe again. It had been one of those exhausting days, the kind that made me question why I had taken so many classes this semester. My brain was fried from back-to-back lectures, and all I wanted was to grab a quick meal before heading home. That's how I ended up pulling into the McDonald's parking lot just off I-35 in Austin, Texas. The place was still fairly busy despite the late hour, with a few cars scattered around the lot and the bright neon sign flickering in the cold night air. As I stepped out of my car, something caught my eye. Near a black sedan, a man and a woman were standing close, their body language tense. At first, it just looked like a couple arguing, nothing too unusual. The guy seemed agitated, talking fast, while the woman had her arms crossed, shifting uncomfortably. I hesitated for a second, debating whether I should keep walking or pay attention. People argued all the time. Maybe they'd cool off in a few minutes. But then things escalated. The man suddenly grabbed her wrist, yanking her closer. She tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip. My stomach twisted. It didn't feel like a normal argument anymore. I slowed my steps, pretending to check my phone while keeping an eye on them. The woman shook her head, her body rigid with tension, but the guy wasn't letting go. A part of me still hoped someone else would step in. There were people inside McDonald's, some sitting in their cars. Someone had to be watching this too, right? But no one moved. Then, before I could even process what was happening, the man shoved the woman hard against the car and forced her inside. The door slammed shut. That was the moment everything shifted. A muffled scream came from inside the car. Not an argument, not a bad breakup. This was something much worse. I felt my pulse spike, my body tensing as adrenaline kicked in. My mind screamed at me to act, but for a split second I froze. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops? Yell for help? The parking lot felt eerily silent despite the passing cars on the highway. Then, instinct took over. I ran toward the car without thinking. My heart pounded as I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. The guy barely had time to react before I threw my fist forward, hitting him square in the face. The impact sent a shock through my knuckles, but I barely registered the pain. The woman scrambled out of the car, stumbling as she caught her breath. The man clutched his face, cursing under his breath, his eyes flashing with anger. For a moment, I thought he might retaliate. But then, movement from the side caught my attention. Two other guys, who had apparently seen what was happening from inside the restaurant, stepped forward. The guy in the car assessed the situation, realizing he was outnumbered. Without a word, he threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as he sped out of the parking lot and disappeared into the night. The woman stood there, shaking, her hands gripping her jacket like she was holding herself together. I turned to her, still catching my breath, and the only thing I could think was how close she had just come to disappearing. The moment the car disappeared into the night, a heavy silence settled over the parking lot. My hands were still shaking from the rush of adrenaline, my knuckles throbbing where they had connected with the guy's face. The woman, still visibly shaken, took a few deep breaths, trying to steady herself. She looked around, as if making sure he was really gone. A few seconds later, one of the guys who had stepped in, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a flannel jacket, asked if she was okay. She nodded quickly, but the fear in her eyes hadn't faded. That's when she said something that made my stomach drop. She didn't know the man. He wasn't her boyfriend or even an ex. He was a complete stranger. He had tried to force her into his car. The weight of that realization hit me hard. If I hadn't been there, or if I had ignored my gut and kept walking, she could have been gone. Just like that. The thought made me feel sick. I pulled out my phone and called 911. My hands were still unsteady, and my voice came out faster than I intended as I explained what had happened. The dispatcher asked if anyone was hurt and told us to stay where we were. They were sending officers to take our statements. While we waited, the woman, her name was Megan, hugged her arms around herself, still visibly shaken. The guy in the flannel jacket, Marcus, offered her his coat, and she took it with a quiet, "Thank you." The other guy, Jared, stood near the entrance of the McDonald's, keeping an eye on the lot as if expecting the car to return. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens cut through the night. 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue against the pavement. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, scanning the scene before approaching. One of them, Officer Reynolds, asked us to go over what had happened from the beginning. Megan spoke first, her voice unsteady but clear. She explained how she had just been walking to her car after grabbing food when the man approached her, acting friendly at first. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed her arm and tried to force her inside his car. When she resisted, he got angry, shoving her against the door. That's when I had stepped in. I recounted everything I saw, from the initial argument to the moment I opened the car door and threw the punch. Marcus and Jared backed up my story, adding details I hadn't even registered in the heat of the moment, like how the guy had been scanning the lot before grabbing Megan, as if making sure no one was watching. The officers took notes, asked follow-up questions, and then checked the McDonald's security cameras. The manager on duty let them access the footage, which had captured the whole thing. They even got a partial view of the guy's license plate before he sped off. Officer Reynolds reassured Megan that they had enough to track him down. He asked if she wanted to go to the station to give a full statement, but she shook her head, saying she just wanted to go home. One of the officers offered to escort her, and she accepted. Before leaving, she turned to me, her expression unreadable for a second before softening. She thanked me, really thanked me, not just for stepping in, but for not hesitating when it counted. As I watched the patrol cars pull away, the weight of everything that had just happened settled in. I had come here for a burger, and instead, I had stopped something that could have ended in a way I didn't even want to think about. I took a deep breath, staring at the now empty parking lot. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its place. I had always heard stories about things like this happening, but I never thought I'd be part of one. That night, I realized something. Sometimes it's easier to look away, to assume someone else will handle it. But sometimes, the only thing standing between a victim and a nightmare is the decision to act. The next morning, I woke up feeling the lingering effects of the previous night. My body ached, my knuckles were sore, and my mind was still processing everything that had happened. It didn't feel real. One minute, I was just a tired college student grabbing a late-night meal, and the next, I was in the middle of a crime scene. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the scream, the punch, the way the guy had fled as soon as he realized he was outnumbered. I wondered if Megan was okay, if she had been able to sleep after everything. I knew I wouldn't forget that night anytime soon. Later that afternoon, while scrolling through my phone, an unfamiliar number popped up on my screen. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam call, but something told me to pick up. It was Officer Reynolds. He told me they had found the guy. Apparently, he had been caught early that morning in San Marcos, about 30 miles south of Austin. He had checked into a cheap motel, probably thinking he'd lay low until things cooled off. But with the security footage, Megan's description, and the partial license plate, it hadn't taken long for the police to track him down. What hit me the hardest was what the officer said next. This wasn't his first time. The guy, Brandon, had a criminal record. Assault, harassment, even an attempted kidnapping a few years back. He had slipped through the system before, but this time, they had him on solid evidence. He wasn't getting away. Hearing that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment argument gone wrong. He had done this before, and if no one had stepped in last night, he probably would have done it again. The officer thanked me for acting when I did, saying it made their job easier. But all I could think about was Megan. I hoped she had gotten some closure knowing that he was caught. A few days later, I got my answer. I was heading to class when I noticed a message from an unknown number. It was Megan. She thanked me again, saying she had been struggling to find the right words to express how grateful she was. She admitted she had been terrified that night, convinced no one would help her. That part stuck with me. She had felt alone, helpless, until someone decided not to look the other way. That night changed me. I had always thought of myself as just another guy trying to get through life, never imagining I'd be in a situation like that. But it made me realize how fast things can spiral, how easy it is for bad things to happen when people assume someone else will step in. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy who made a choice, and that choice made all the difference. Life moved on after that night. Classes, assignments, the usual stress of being a college student. But something inside me had shifted. Every time I walked through a parking lot at night, I paid more attention. I didn't zone out with my headphones in or scroll through my phone while walking. I looked around. I stayed aware. Because now, I knew how quickly something could go wrong. I never saw Megan again after that message, but that was okay. She had her life to live, and I had mine. But I knew we'd both carry that night with us forever. Sometimes the difference between a tragedy and a rescue is a single decision. And that night, I had made the right one. I was 10 years old when it happened, and even now, years later, I can still remember every detail like it just happened yesterday. It was supposed to be a normal day, just me, my mom, and my little brother Tyler going to McDonald's. That was our little tradition whenever my mom had a rare day off from work. I used to love those days. The excitement of getting a happy meal and playing with the toy inside, feeling like the luckiest kid in the world. That afternoon, we went to a McDonald's in Los Angeles, one of those locations near a busy intersection, packed with people coming in and out. The place smelled like fries and ketchup, and the noise of kids laughing mixed with the sound of the fryer beeping in the back. Everything felt normal until I noticed him. At first, he just looked like any other customer, sitting alone in the corner with a half-eaten burger in front of him. But something about the way he kept glancing at us made me uneasy. He wasn't eating, just sitting there watching. I remember looking away, telling myself I was overthinking, that he was probably just some random guy waiting for someone. We finished eating, and my mom told us to throw away our trash before heading to the car. I didn't think about the man again until I saw him standing outside. He was leaning against a car parked just a few spots away from ours, looking straight at my mom. She didn't seem to notice at first, too busy unlocking the car and making sure we got in. But as soon as she opened the driver's door, he walked up to her. He started talking to her, asking her something in a low voice. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw the way my mom's face changed. Her smile disappeared and she stiffened, gripping the car door tightly. She shook her head and tried to ignore him, but he didn't back off. He kept talking, his voice getting more insistent. I remember how fast everything happened after that. My mom pushed me and Tyler into the car, her movements quick and urgent. She barely had time to get inside herself before he grabbed the door, holding it open. He was saying something. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was sharp, almost mocking. My mom struggled to pull the door shut, but he was stronger. Without hesitating, she slammed the car into reverse, the sudden movement making me and Tyler jerk forward in our seats. The car jolted back, and the man lost his grip, stumbling to the ground. I saw him hit the pavement through the side mirror, but he got up almost immediately, his expression twisting into something furious. Then he ran to his car. The moment he got into his car, my mom stepped on the gas, speeding out of the parking lot like her life depended on it. And maybe it did. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I turned to look through the back window. He was following us. His car, a dark sedan with tinted windows, was right behind us, weaving through traffic to keep up. My mom didn't say a word. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. I could see the fear in her eyes through the rearview mirror, but she stayed focused, taking turn after turn without a real plan. We didn't know where we were going. All she cared about was getting away. Tyler was crying beside me, clutching his little hands together. I didn't know what to do, so I held his arm, trying to stop him from shaking so much. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, but I wasn't sure it would. The man didn't give up. Every street we turned onto, he was right there, just a few car lengths behind. It didn't matter how fast my mom drove or how many lights she ran, he never fell too far behind. It was like he had already decided he wasn't going to stop until he caught us. At some point, my mom swerved onto a highway ramp, trying to lose him in the heavier traffic. It worked, for a moment. Cars got in between us, and for a few terrifying seconds, we thought we had a chance to escape. But then, in my periphery, I saw him again. He had switched lanes, speeding up to get closer. That was when I realized something awful. He wasn't just following us. He was hunting us. The chase went on for what felt like forever. Minutes stretched into eternity as my mom zigzagged through different streets, hoping to shake him. But it wasn't working. She needed a plan. Somewhere safe to go. Somewhere he wouldn't dare follow. Then, all of a sudden, she veered onto another road. I didn't recognize where we were at first, but then I saw the sign. We were heading straight for the Hollywood LAPD station. As soon as my mom pulled into the police station parking lot, she slammed the brakes, the car jerking to a stop. My heart was still racing, but for the first time since we left McDonald's, I felt a sliver of hope. This had to be over. He wouldn't be reckless enough to follow us here. But I was wrong. Before my mom could even take a breath, his car swerved in behind us, tires screeching against the pavement. He wasn't hesitating. He parked so close to us that I thought he was going to ram into our bumper. Then, without missing a beat, he jumped out of his car. Everything happened so fast. My mom flung open her door, bolting towards the entrance of the station. The man was right behind her, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. But before he could reach her, two officers standing outside reacted. They moved fast, intercepting him just as he lunged forward. I watched through the windshield as they tackled him to the ground. He fought back, thrashing and yelling something in Spanish. But they were stronger. Within seconds, they had him pinned down, cuffing his hands behind his back. My mom stood there, shaking, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was trying to hold herself together. I couldn't move. I just sat there, gripping the seat so hard my fingers hurt. Tyler had buried his face against my arm, his little body still trembling. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was over, but I wasn't sure I believed it yet. Inside the station, my mom gave a statement while an officer asked me and Tyler a few questions. I barely remember what I said. My mind was still stuck in the moment when he grabbed the car door, when he chased us through the streets, when he almost caught my mom. It wasn't until later that we found out the truth. He wasn't just some random creep. He was a known criminal, a gang leader with a history of violence. If my mom hadn't reacted the way she did, if she had hesitated for even a second, things could have ended much worse. A few days later, a prosecutor contacted my mom, asking if she would testify against him. But she refused. She was afraid that his people would come after us, that we would never be safe if she took it any further. I never blamed her for that decision. She did what she had to do to protect us. But after that day, I never stepped foot inside a McDonald's again. Even now, just the smell of it brings everything rushing back. The fear, the panic, the sound of my mom's car speeding through the streets with a stranger chasing us. Some things you just never forget. Back when I was 17, my friends and I had this routine. Every Thursday after our evening yoga class, we'd hit the McDonald's on Burnside Street in Portland. It wasn't anything special, just a familiar spot where we could grab some fries and unwind. The smell of grease clung to the air, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the late-night crowd was always a weird mix of college kids, truckers, and families trying to quiet down their screaming toddlers. For months, everything was normal. The same workers were always there, the same menu, the same half-broken ice cream machine. But then one night we noticed someone new behind the counter. He was tall and lanky, with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in weeks. Something about the way he moved caught my attention. His gestures were too stiff, too robotic, like he was forcing himself to act normal. Every so often he would glance at us. Not the kind of look you give when you're just scanning the restaurant, but a fixed, almost studying stare. At first, we laughed it off. He was probably just awkward, maybe bad at social interactions. But then, it became a pattern. No matter what time we went, no matter how busy the place was, he was always there. It got to the point where I could feel his eyes on us the moment we walked in. He never spoke, at least not to us. But his presence was unsettling. Sometimes he would stand at the register just watching, before suddenly disappearing into the back. Then, one night, things got even weirder. We had just finished our usual order, nuggets, fries, sodas, when Maya, my best friend, checked her phone and froze. A DM from a blank Instagram account had popped up. It only had one message. "I see you like McDonald's fries. You always leave one behind. Why?" It was enough to send a chill through all of us. Maya showed us the screen, and we just stared at each other in silence. The account had no posts, no followers, nothing. We tried to laugh it off, pretend it was some dumb joke, but there was no denying how specific it was. Someone had been watching us closely enough to notice a small, insignificant habit. We decided not to think too much about it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe one of our other friends was messing with us. But deep down, something about it felt wrong. That feeling only got worse. A few weeks passed and we kept going to McDonald's, even though the weirdness lingered in the back of our minds. The new guy, Greg, at least that's what his name tag said, was always there, moving in that same stiff, unnatural way. His eyes had this hollow quality, like he was looking through people instead of at them. Every time we placed an order, he was watching. If another employee took our order, he'd linger nearby, pretending to clean or restock something, but his attention never fully shifted away from us. One night, the tension hit a new level. We had just sat down at our usual booth, talking about school, when I noticed Greg standing at the counter, staring, not casually glancing our way, staring. I nudged Maya, who turned and saw it too. The moment we made eye contact, he vanished into the back kitchen. It felt off, more than usual. Then, our order took longer than normal. The place wasn't even busy, but we sat there waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Employees bustled around behind the counter, but our food never came. When it finally did, Greg was the one who brought it out. He didn't say a word, just placed the tray on the counter. His fingers lingered for a second too long on the edge of the tray before he stepped back. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Something about the air around him felt wrong. We grabbed the food and left quickly, deciding to eat in the car instead. That's when things went from unsettling to downright terrifying. Sitting in the car, I pulled my nuggets out of the bag. The box felt strange in my hands, like the cardboard was damp. Confused, I lifted the lid, and my stomach immediately turned. A thick, slimy substance covered the nuggets. It wasn't sauce. It wasn't anything that should have been in a fast food bag. The texture looked wrong, unnatural, almost like it was melting into the chicken. A sour, chemical-like smell filled the car. I could barely process what I was seeing before Maya gasped. Brooke, in the passenger seat, grabbed my wrist and held the box up to the dim parking lot light. The way it glistened made my skin crawl. It wasn't something spilled by accident. Someone had put it there on purpose. Panic set in instantly. Maya gagged, shoving the bag away from her. Brooke's hands were shaking as she rolled down the window and tossed the entire meal into a nearby trash can. None of us spoke for a solid minute. The reality of what just happened was sinking in fast. Someone had tampered with our food, and there was only one person who had handled it. The drive home was silent. The moment we got out of the parking lot, Maya locked the doors, and Brooke kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone to be following us. I could still smell it, that weird, rancid stench from the nuggets. It clung to my hands, my clothes, even though I hadn't touched the stuff. My mind kept looping back to Greg handing me the tray, his fingers barely brushing against mine. He had done something to our food. There was no doubt about it. Back at my house, we all sat in my room, trying to process what just happened. Brooke searched online, looking for anything similar. Other stories of fast food workers messing with people's food. At first, it was just the usual horror stories. Employees spitting in orders, videos of people dropping burgers on the floor. But then, Maya found something. A Reddit thread about contaminated food incidents. One post, buried deep in the comments, stood out. A user described an experience eerily similar to ours. McDonald's employee gave me a meal with a weird substance in it. The texture was off, smelled bad. I got a bad feeling and threw it out. A week later, I saw the same employee get fired for unhygienic behavior. He was weird, barely talked, stared at people. Something was wrong with him. We sat there, reading it over and over, the way they described it, the smell, the unsettling presence of the employee. It was too much of a coincidence. Maya checked Google reviews for our McDonald's. We had never really paid attention before, but suddenly it felt urgent. That's when we saw it. A 1-star review posted just a few days earlier. "Do not eat here. Something is wrong with the food." No details, no explanation, just those words. A heavy silence filled the room. No one needed to say it out loud. We all knew what we were thinking. We should report this, but none of us wanted to. The thought of going back, of talking to someone about what happened, made my skin crawl. What if Greg found out? What if he knew where we lived? What if he had done this before and nothing had happened to him? I turned my phone over, my stomach still twisting in knots. I had lost my appetite completely. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I never wanted to go back there again. The next morning, though, something told me we needed to check one last time. Maya and I drove to McDonald's in broad daylight, telling ourselves it was just to see if Greg was still there. Maybe we were overreacting. Maybe we had imagined the whole thing to be worse than it really was. But as soon as we pulled into the lot, he was there. Greg stood outside, leaning against the side of the building, smoking a cigarette. His eyes locked onto us immediately, and then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a smirk. It was knowing. He waved. Maya barely stopped at the red light as we peeled out of there. That night, my phone buzzed with a notification. Another DM. From a new blank account. "You didn't like my special sauce?" I stared at my phone, my breath caught in my throat. The message sat there, glowing on my screen like a sick joke. My hands felt cold as I showed it to Maya and Brooke in our group chat. None of us responded. We didn't know what to say. Blocking the account was the only thing I could do, but it didn't change the fact that he knew. He had seen us drive away that morning. He had smiled. And now, he was reaching out. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin prickle. Every shadow through my blinds felt like it could be someone standing there, watching. The logical part of me knew it was just paranoia. But another part, the part that had seen Greg's expression, that it felt something fundamentally wrong about him. Couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. We never went back to that McDonald's. None of us even drove past it. We told our parents what happened, who told us we should report it. But something held us back. Maybe it was fear of retaliation. Maybe it was the creeping realization that no one would actually do anything. If he had done this before and was still there, what were the chances that some random teenage girls making a complaint would actually change anything? A few months later, I was scrolling through the local news when a headline made my stomach drop. Local McDonald's under investigation for food contamination. The article was vague, just a small blurb about an ongoing investigation. It didn't name anyone. It didn't give details. But I knew. Greg was gone. The article mentioned that one of the employees had left without notice right before the investigation started. No charges were filed, no follow-ups were reported. It was like he had just disappeared. To this day, I don't eat at McDonald's. It's not the food itself that bothers me. It's the memory of that night. The sight of something that shouldn't have been there, covering my food. The way Greg watched us. The way he knew things he shouldn't have known. And the way he never got caught. Looking back, I should have known things would turn ugly the moment we got the house. At first, it felt like a dream. Vanessa and I were finally getting a place of our own. And the fact that it had belonged to her grandmother made it even more special. The place had been sitting empty for months, sure, and it needed a ton of work, but the price was too good to pass up. We were already making plans for renovations, picking out colors, and imagining what it would look like once it was truly ours. What we didn't expect was the backlash from her family. Her aunt Linda had always been difficult, but we never thought she'd care this much about the house. Apparently her sons, Eric and Cody, had assumed they'd end up with it, even though they never lifted a finger to help Vanessa's grandma while she was alive. The tension started small, passive-aggressive comments at family gatherings, weird looks from them when we talked about our plans. But things escalated fast. One afternoon, I pulled into the driveway and noticed an old truck parked out front. My stomach dropped. The house was supposed to be empty. I stepped out of the car cautiously, taking in the broken lock on the side door. My pulse quickened as I walked in. And there he was, Eric, standing in the middle of the living room, looking like he had just been caught red-handed. He didn't act surprised. Instead, he acted annoyed, like I was the one who had no right to be there. He muttered something about seeing an unfamiliar car and wanting to make sure everything was okay. A pathetic excuse. His eyes darted around the room like he had been searching for something, and I didn't buy his story for a second. When I told him to leave, he hesitated, but then smirked and strolled out like he had all the time in the world. That night, Vanessa and I changed every lock in the house and installed security cameras. We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong. The days that followed were tense. Vanessa kept checking the security footage, jumping at every little noise outside. I tried to act like I wasn't worried, but deep down I felt it too. Something about the way Eric had looked at me that day stuck in my head, like he was sizing me up, calculating something. Linda, of course, brushed off the whole thing. She acted like we were overreacting, saying that Eric was just misunderstood. Meanwhile, Cody, the quieter of the two brothers, started making cryptic posts online. Nothing too direct, just vague, passive-aggressive nonsense about how some people take what doesn't belong to them. We ignored it. It was easier that way. For a couple of weeks, things were quiet. No sign of Eric, no strange cars in the driveway. We started to relax, convincing ourselves that maybe it had all blown over. One evening, after running errands, Vanessa and I decided to stop at a McDonald's in Scottsdale for a quick bite. We ordered, sat down, and were halfway through our meal when I noticed him. Eric was sitting alone, a few tables away, staring at us. He didn't look away when I met his gaze. He just sat there, expressionless, like he was waiting for something. I nudged Vanessa, and she tensed up immediately. At first, we tried to ignore him. Maybe he was just there by coincidence. Maybe he'd leave soon. But then he got up and walked toward the play area where a group of kids were running around. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at us. Something about the way he moved made every instinct in me scream that something was off. My pulse sped up as he got closer. He wasn't just watching us, he was trying to get a reaction. I had been on edge for weeks, and I wasn't about to let this go any further. I stood up, stepping between him and Vanessa, making it clear I wasn't in the mood for whatever game he was playing. The moment he smirked at me, something inside me snapped. Everything happened so fast. 1 second, I was stepping forward, trying to make it clear that Eric needed to back off. The next, I was throwing a punch. I barely even thought about it. It was pure instinct, built up from weeks of tension and unspoken threats. My fist connected with his jaw, and for the first time, that smug expression disappeared. He staggered back, but instead of fighting back, he did something I didn't expect. He started yelling, loud. "He's attacking me! Somebody call the cops!" Heads turned, people gasped, and suddenly it looked like I was the aggressor. I wasn't about to let him twist the story. Before he could pull any more of his usual manipulation, I reached for my phone and called 911 myself. If he wanted to play the victim, I'd rather have the cops hear my side first. When the police arrived, Eric stuck to his usual routine, playing innocent, acting like he was just minding his business when I snapped. But here's the thing, McDonald's has cameras, witnesses, and people had seen him watching us, following us. The footage made it clear he was the one provoking the situation. Instead of me getting in trouble, the officers warned him to stay away from us. They even suggested we file a restraining order. By the next morning, Vanessa and I were sitting in an office, signing the paperwork to make sure he and his mother couldn't come near us again. Linda, of course, threw a fit. But at that point, we didn't care. We cut off all contact. No more texts, no more family events. As far as we were concerned, they didn't exist. After that, things finally settled. The house became ours, not just on paper, but in a way that felt real. We painted the walls, fixed what needed fixing, and slowly the fear started to fade. Eric and Cody, they vanished from our lives, just like that. And honestly, that was the best thing that ever happened to us.